Hello and welcome to this month's session on teaching with the brain in mind. And today we're going to be kind of tackling this really important topic that is really something that I've just seen again and again that has been a struggle for a lot of schools and a lot of families, and that's this idea of bridging the gap between school and home. And so really what's kind of at the core of this is that recognition that there's so much that we're trying to do to support a child, and there's a lot of different people who are at play in all this. And two of the biggest, though they're not exclusive, but two of the biggest arenas that really impact a child's life is who they're with at home and who they're with at school day in and day out. And what I find interesting, which to be really quite frank with you, is kind of the purpose behind starting in mind services, is that we found that after example and example and example, we just saw again and again and again that this kind of relationship between school and home, in many cases, wasn't a positive one. And most specifically, in the cases of a child that was struggling, a child that was not doing well in school or getting in trouble a lot outside of school, and often children that might be experiencing both of those things, that's where these relationships were really strained the most. And so we really wanted to take some time today to discuss some of what goes into that. And really, we're going to spend most of our time really focused on one kind of succinct approach that really helps us to work through a basic understanding of how to really bridge that gap, support those relationships a bit better. Now, there is a lot that goes into kind of creating this gap that we're discussing. So I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to conclude that this is an exhaustive list of kind of what's in that gap. And there's also a lot of very specific things that might impact just different regions of our country, different specific school districts, different relationships, different histories that are happening in different areas. So there's a lot that can really be part of the sources of the gap. But there's a few kind of generalized elements that I think are really key that we're going to spend some time talking about today. The first is that there is the perception, I use that word carefully, there's the perception of having opposing viewpoints. And we'll explore that a little bit more. But the reason that I like to really talk about that word perception is that oftentimes when we really dig down to it, if you were to actually sit back and think for a moment, you all probably have the same basic goal, which is you want the best thing possible for your child. As a teacher, you are trying to support every student. You want the best thing possible for that student and for the other students in the class for that matter. And so you have this kind of combined goal, but at times it feels like your viewpoint is at opposition with another. And so there might be some kind of big issues there. Communication is often, not always, I'm not trying to make big generalizations here, but is often being limited to times of crisis. And so we'll kind of explore that, but that's one of these areas that I've seen where if we only ever talk in the crisis times, in the challenging times, that really can make it challenging to foster a really positive and healthy relationship. And then lastly, which both of these kind of begin to touch on a little bit, but we end up taking a non-collaborative approach. We end up taking, once again, an approach that assumes we're at different viewpoints, and we end up being kind of contesting one another, in battle with one another, way more than we are trying to work with one another. And what I think is just so key about that, and this is really where we're going to spend the majority of the time today on that collaborative approach, is that it, once again, it harms the child more than anybody else when we are kind of opposing with one another and not working together. We find so often, whether it's within schools or in communities, we just have these different silos. The silos don't necessarily communicate well to each other. They don't collaborate well with one another. And when we have these silos, it really makes it challenging to, once again, provide a child with the high level of support that they may need to be able to be successful. And so, as always, I want to be crystal clear that, this is all about, once again, teaching with the brain in mind. Now, granted, this is not strictly focused on things that you're doing specifically in your classroom, but really, this is thinking a lot about just the basics of the brain and the reality that our own brains and the brains of our students and the brains of the families that you're going to be talking to, they all have some really kind of distinct roles in all of this that have a really big impact on our capacity to be able to relate to others. Now, one of the things that is very core to our brains is that our brains are relational. Our brains look at most people as though, what is our relationship with them? Now, granted, in life, you can see a lot of people, the car that you're driving past, the person you pass by on the street, there's a lot of people that you don't have a relationship with. They are neutral entities that you just know exist. And if there's nothing that you're kind of seeing there that's dangerous, they can kind of fall into this neutral zone. And so that's the vast majority of people. But anybody who you need to be in any type of relationship with, our brain begins to file and ask ourselves, is this a safe person or is this not a safe person? Even people that we don't have a serious relationship with. It could be the cashier at the grocery market. You might realize, oh, I'd rather go in that aisle. That person's friendly. They talk to me. They always, do a great job bagging my stuff versus that one who always seems like they're in a bad mood. So your brain is kind of saying, okay, I feel more attracted to that person. I feel less attracted to that person. Our brain is doing that. And that can really, play a big role in driving how we respond to something. And then once again, with our relational brains, if we know that we have a certain type of contested relationship with somebody, we often enter that in a much different way. So once again, just to use that overly simplistic example, if you find yourself, wow, the only checkout that is open right now is this cashier that drives me absolutely nuts and I always find so rude, you're likely going to enter into that with a different body language than you would if it was the person that you have a really fond relationship with and enjoy talking to. You're going to walk up and you're going to be more closed off. You're going to actually hyper analyze what that person is saying and doing, because you are wanting essentially to have data that says, okay, this is really confirming my belief that this person is mean, that this person is rude. I can't tell you how many times, I've kind of encountered somebody like that. And my wife and I will kind of talk about it afterwards. Can you believe they said this or that? And what we realize is, you know what? If they said this or that and I didn't have these preconceived notions, I would have thought nothing of it. But because of my preconceived notion of that person, when they said something, I immediately kind of jumped to the conclusion that, oh, they were saying that to be rude. They were saying that to get under my skin. They were saying that because they're so selfish or whatever the case might be. And so we really walk into these different relationships with a certain kind of conception in mind as to what the goal of that person is, why they might say or do the things that they're doing. And we assume that it's going to be negative. We assume that it's not something that's going to end positive. And this is normal. This is, once again, self-preservation. Our brains want to be relational. Our brains are focused on seeing, who do I trust? Who do I not trust? Once again, from a survivalist standpoint, so that we're able to handle whatever the world may ultimately throw at us. And so that's a normal thing. But here's what we find often happens. When we kind of now take this whole idea and we bring it to the school perspective, we bring it to this idea of conversations that you as a teacher or an administrator, a school staff of any point might have to have with a family. If you have had any type of negative interaction with that family before, or you've been told things about that family that might be a little bit more negative, that they might be a little bit more challenging, or even if you know nothing about that specific family, but you have had experiences with other families in similar scenarios where you had to have a similar conversation that didn't go well, all of a sudden your antennae go up to say, okay, this might be a little bit challenging. This might be a little bit difficult. And so it is predictable, if you have had any of those things before that might say that this has the potential of being a negative interaction, it is predictable to say that you are going to walk into that and assume it's going to be negative. And if you assume it's going to be negative, you are significantly increasing the likelihood that it is indeed going to be a negative interaction. And once again, to use that word that we'll use again in a moment, the perception of a negative interaction. So it doesn't matter. It could actually technically be positive or fairly neutral, but if you perceive it as negative, if you're twisting words a certain way to believe that it's likely going to be negative, then all of a sudden your brain stores that as a negative response. And your guard is going to be up even higher next time you have to engage with that person. And so suddenly, this person that we want to be in a positive relationship with, we begin putting up more and more barriers in front of, which makes it more and more challenging to make sure that we're actually having a positive relationship with them. Now, what's good about this is that one of the best ways to really address this a little bit differently is honestly just utilizing our cortical control. I'm assuming as a teacher that you have a well-developed cortex, you're able to do cortical modulation pretty well, where you just need to kind of walk into it and really kind of convince yourself to go into it open-minded. You really want to be hyper intentional about helping yourself realize, okay, this is an isolated situation. This is a new person, and really trying to give that individual the benefit of the doubt. Similarly, you could also be really intentional about, how am I going to be positive with this person? How am I going to really embrace this relationship in a positive way? And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more as we go through here today as well. But knowing that that can actually be far more reciprocated. So just being hyper intentional there. And the last piece that I want to say about our relational brains is that one of the things that's unique about our brain is it takes almost no time at all to make a first impression. I mean, you're talking in some cases milliseconds, but typically only a couple seconds to make a first impression with somebody. And that's them making a first impression of you and you making a first impression of them. And even though a first impression is made so quickly, it is really, really challenging to break. And so being, once again, very, very mindful of what's the first impression that I'm leaving when I might have to reach out to a parent or a caregiver. Like, what is that going to look like? Am I diving right in, clearly flustered and frustrated and annoyed? Or am I able to kind of dive in first, seeming like, hey, I'm a loving, caring person. I'm friendly. I'm collaborative. Like, I'm really here to work with you. And so being very, very mindful of that. And then similarly, thinking about the first time that you might have met somebody that might be a parent or a caregiver that you don't have the most positive rapport with, kind of ask yourself, okay, well, why were they walking in with that first impression when I first met them, and realizing what they may have been going through and what the situation was around that first conversation. And so once again, just trying to be mindful of, we can only control ourselves, but we might have to do a little bit of our own mind control of ourselves to really think through what somebody else is going through and how we can just best support them moving forward. And so to kind of go through a couple of these areas, so first and foremost, we have just this perception of opposing viewpoints. And so most communication that is happening between schools and parents, we're finding is really the perception as somebody's doing something wrong. Like, that's kind of the core of what is often being heard. And this is often being heard because emotions might be high. It might be a very, very challenging conversation, but oftentimes as you reach out to a parent is feeling like you're saying to them that they are a bad parent. Now, I know that you are not saying that to them. I know that you are not calling up and being like, hey, just wanted to let you know you're doing a terrible job. Like, we would never, ever, ever do that. But especially if we're not very, very mindful of our words, that's the perception that a lot of parents end up getting when they receive that call from school. And so all of a sudden, this thing that they are going to be very, very emotional about, like this thing that is so much part of their identity, their parenting skills, they feel like is at question. Now, you and I know that when you're calling home, it's typically not to question somebody's parenting skills. And so we need to separate out the fact from how they're perceiving this conversation right now. Because the moment somebody feels like you are calling out their parenting skills, once again, walls go up, an emotional response ensues. They likely begin to shift lower in their brain, and it becomes far more challenging to be able to do that. And so we need to be very, very mindful of what we're saying. And then conversely, when the parent then kind of argues back a little bit more, which is a predictable response, because now they're lower in their brain, they're reacting, they may not be putting as much time and thought before what they're about to say. All of a sudden, you as the teacher are now like, you're saying I'm a bad teacher. And second to being a bad parent, probably being bad at your profession doesn't feel good either, right? And so all of a sudden, you have these two people that feel like, and sometimes it's reality, oftentimes it's not, feel like somebody's attacking you, talking about you not having these proper skills. And it puts you at these really kind of polarized, opposing places. And so all of a sudden, we're not working together, we're fighting against each other. Now, once again, we're utilizing the instrument of talking about the child there, but it has this perception that we're battling back and forth. And so these conversations become more polarized, and you find yourself arguing all sorts of different points. And in many cases, these turn into you having an argument about something that you don't even care about. So all of a sudden, your conversation has transitioned from, all right, had to call home because of something that happened at school, to I'm feeling offended and I've managed to offend this person. And now we're arguing about some maybe school policy, maybe schedule change, maybe whatever, that wasn't the purpose of the call in the first place. And you are taking a polarizing view of that thing that you don't actually care about in the first place, but just because you now feel like you're in opposition to this person. And so it's important to realize kind of, once again, what happens here as we both, and all humans do it, move lower and lower in our brains, we begin to kind of be way more reactive, way more emotional, and we are way more likely to kind of grab onto an idea or a premise, and we're way more likely to purposefully disagree with somebody rather than being intentional about agreeing with that person. And we forget then that their whole point behind all of this is to support the student. And so one of the things that's most important is to realize that it's very rare. I'm not going to say it never exists. It's very rare that you're going to find a parent or caregiver that just doesn't care about their child, doesn't care about their child's education and things like that. The vast, vast, vast majority of adults care about that. They might not value education quite as much as you do. They might have different ideas of the how and the why. But once again, the vast majority of parents care about education. And similarly, I believe, especially if you're watching this video right now, but that the vast, vast, vast majority of teachers care about their students' education, care about them learning. And you believe that you have something in school and in education that can really prompt that child up to future successes. And that's why you do the things that you do. Very rarely do people get into education because they found out it's a great place to just drive kids nuts and you don't like kids. Like, nobody does that. So we're doing it to support the child. It doesn't mean that you don't get burnt out at times. It doesn't mean that you don't get frustrated at times. I'm not trying to imply any of that. But what it does mean is that we are there to support the child. That is kind of the premise behind our existence in that building. And so what's interesting there is that there's this perception of opposing viewpoints, but there is this place in the middle where, once again, though you might have different approaches to it, or you might be in a challenging spot to really be able to listen to one another, there is this place in the middle where it's like, oh, we both have the same goal in mind. Our goal is really about being able to come together. Our goal is really about being able to support this child. And instead of supporting the child, we accidentally are creating an environment where we're fighting about the child way more, or we're fighting about things completely unrelated to the child. And so really being intentional about keeping that in mind as you go into any conversation with an adult, and being, really mindful about, okay, how can we try to separate that? And once again, if you just kind of go into it with that at the top of your mind, that, there's the potential we're going to walk into this conversation and get frustrated and upset. Like, the more that you prepare yourself for that, the faster you can kind of say, like, oh, stop, hold up. I'm feeling emotional. I'm feeling frustrated right now. And that's not the goal of this. And I'm sorry for that. Even if it's not your fault, you could say, I'm sorry for that. But really what this is about helping your child. And so once again, bringing the path back again and again to remembering that though you might have some opposing views, in reality, for the most part, you have one thing that is going to be aligned, and that is that you both love and care about that child, and you want to give them the best support that you possibly can. And I think that is one of the best foundations that you can have as you're thinking about bridging that gap between school and home. Always bringing it back to the fact that, you know what, there is going to be some overlap between you and the parent. And even if approaches look different, the heart, the purpose behind everything here is 100% going to be aligned. Now, another big one that I have found occur again and again and again is that if we wait until a time of crisis to have this conversation with families, to really, embark on any communication with family, it often is going to kind of lead to really, really challenging moments. And so we often wait till things are kind of bad at school. Once again, that's our perception of bad, or that they've done something quote unquote bad, but we often wait until things are not going well. And that's when we reach out to school, or that's when, if something's happening at home, they might reach out to school, or if at school, we might reach out to home. And so that's kind of one of those kind of key areas where we really want to be intentional about, like, first conversation we have, can we do it before there's a problem? Now, I get it. Sometimes there's problems on day one, but it's going to be challenging. One of the schools that I worked with, one of the big goals early on in the year was, first couple of weeks, let's try to have somebody reach out to every single family. So like every family is being reached out by somebody at the school that's really just kind of reaching out to say, here's something great that's happened so far. And then doing that a couple times a year, so that a few times throughout the course of the year, that family's receiving a call. It's like, hey, I just wanted to let you know your child's doing so well with their reading, or I just wanted to let you know that they are being so kind and inclusive to their friends at recess, or they're doing such a great job showing up with a positive attitude. Whatever it might be academic, it might be more social emotional in nature. It might even just be, yeah, they're a talker. You told us that, but man, they are handling the redirections like a champ. And so you are calling with the sole purpose. It's not the sandwiching the positive and the negative. That's helpful as well. But with the sole purpose of just positive, I just wanted to let you know that. Have a great day. And I cannot tell you how many times in doing that, families picked up the phone and they're like, okay, I'm ready for this. Especially like the high school parents, where they've been, called in the school hundreds of times since their child was in elementary school. And all of a sudden it's week one and that phone rings. They're like, oh my goodness, what did my child do this time? And you're like, they did great. And I just wanted to let you know that. Because when that's the core of the, kind of the foundation of that relationship, suddenly what that really provides an opportunity for is that parent knowing, like, oh, you do care. You do see the positive. Because one of the things I've heard from a lot of adults, is a lot of parents, that is that they're like, you know what, they only see the things my child does wrong. And to make it crystal clear, nope, we also see the things that your child does right. That's super helpful. And when you have a child that is that kind of frequent flyer, the child that you might end up needing to reach out to home a lot for, being intentional about, maybe for them every couple of weeks, I'm going to try to call out just for some of these positive things. And so really being mindful of that. Also, really kind of listening to your families and figuring out what are ways that we can really get them in the door to just have other kind of positive interactions with them that might be like communicating some school things, but are just kind of an opportunity to have like a positive embrace. And so, like, I remember one of the schools I worked with a while ago, they would host these kind of events, and they would find out, like, okay, almost no parents came. They'd get like literally 1% to 2% of parent participation. And they're like, all right, well, let's just start sending out like some surveys to families and beginning to figure it out. And they figured out, okay, our timing was all wrong on these because parents don't have time. They need to get to school. There's too much of an expectation. It doesn't feel like something you can come and go to. I need time to eat. Like they just were kind of discovering all these really, really just simple and tangible things. And so they started, all right, once a week now, we serve pancakes in our cafeteria starting, and it's like 40 minutes before the school would open, and just anyone's invited. You can come in, you can eat, your kids can eat, anybody that wants to eat can eat. Come on in. And there's certain staff members there. It's a great time to kind of connect. If there's some handouts that need to go home to families that are being sent with kids, but we know that they sometimes get lost, those are available there. And it's just a great time to connect. Once again, not to necessarily dive into any issues that a child's dealing with, but more just like, general communication, and relationship building. And so it's that opportunity to make more of those positive connections, but all of a sudden the connections don't have to be 100% centered around the child. You can actually just build a regular relationship with that adult. And so once again, not all communication now is problem related. You're beginning to foster just a normal human relationship in moments like that. Another thing that I see kind of occurring a lot is that when we utilize that call to home as a punishment rather than as a tool of support. And I saw this a lot in some of the elementary schools I've been in before, where literally, the child's acting up like, I need you to stop, I need you to stop. And then they hold that phone and are like, I'm going to call mom right now, or I'm going to call grandma right now, or I'm going to, and so literally they're utilizing that as like, you know what, here's kind of the bad guy. I'm going to call the bad guy right now. Like, if you're not listening to me, God only knows what they're going to do. And so they're utilizing that kind of idea as a threat. And so once again, you're utilizing that just in this time of crisis where emotions are going to be high, things are going to be challenging, the child's emotions are going to be high, your emotions are pretty high in that moment. And so then when all of a sudden we are embracing in these conversations, when our emotions are high and the family's emotions are high, it creates this really challenging moment. So whether that is that every time you reach out, it's bad news. So once again, that's the adult putting that guard up. Or every time you reach out, you're just at your wit's end. And now I'm frustrated and I'm trying to solve this problem from a distance. Like, it's creating these really high emotion moments where you're basically calling to say, hey, fix this problem, or here's what's going wrong right here. And so it's really hard to have a positive and collaborative approach in those moments, because instead you're just having a very human, very emotional response in those moments in time. And so we're just realizing that how we handle that, what we do in those moments, that's not something that's going to be able to be as positive. Now, here's the reality. There's times that we do need to call in a time of crisis. Whether it is in the moment because a child's not doing well, I wouldn't do it in front of the class, but I get that there's moments that we might need to, call out for support, for support. There's also just those times where, yep, the child had some really, really challenging behaviors, and we need to call home and talk to them about it, whether it's because there's specific consequences or whether it's because we need to come up with a better plan to help. But if that's the only time we're calling, it's predictable that it's not going to be received as well as we want it to. And so instead, if we are mindful about building a foundation with other calls that can be positive, other calls that can be more constructive, other calls that are more about relationship building and other opportunities for relationship building, when we can counterbalance it with that, suddenly the emotions aren't as high when we do need to have the tough conversations. And suddenly, once again, they know that this is a person that loves my child. I've seen evidence of it. This is a person that can see the positive in my child. I've seen evidence of it. And so it really sets the stage for having a far more collaborative conversation where you're going to be able to move into that in a way that has the potential of being a lot more positive. And so when we are taking these non-collaborative approaches, people are often kind of quick to talk and slow to listen. So once again, when we have those kind of high emotional moments, we're real quick to say what all the problems are. And then we're kind of slow to actually listen. Even if that person's talking, we're usually kind of like, I've just seen people kind of pull the phone away. They're checked out in that moment in time. They're not really embracing what that other person has to say. And oftentimes it is a very highly emotionally driven response that individual may be giving at that time. We're quick to use our own solutions, but we're hesitant to consider other solutions. So when we're taking a non-collaborative approach, we're calling home and we're pretty quick to just say, here's what needs to happen if they're going to come back. Here's what needs to happen if they're going to be successful. And so we're really quick to kind of just lay out, here's what's going on here. But once again, kind of with that slow to listen, we're not reaching out to be like, hey, does that work? Hey, do you have any other ideas? Do you think that's going to be successful? And then even though we might try to get everybody to agree, so like I've been to schools where they do that, right? They say, here's the problem, here's the plan. And now when your child comes back, they need to sign this piece of paper that says that they are going to follow along with this plan. And because in that moment, maybe they do agree with it, or because they need to go back to school, they sign that plan. and then they come to school. But moving forward, usually at least one of the parties is not convinced that the plan will actually be effective. And sometimes both parties aren't actually convinced that that plan is going to be effective. And when that happens, all of a sudden, you're just setting yourself up for failure again. And chances are, whether it's that day or the next, that child's going to exhibit those same behaviors of concern because they really kind of signed off on a plan that probably didn't really address their needs, that wasn't really kind of meeting the expectations that they personally have of what they need to be able to be successful when they're in school. And so what we're really talking about now is this whole idea of taking a much more collaborative approach. There's this program called Collaborative Problem Solving, also called CPS. It was started by two gentlemen, one named Stuart Avalon, one named Ross Green. And it's really about recognizing this need to take a much more collaborative approach. And so we're going to kind of be talking about this two different ways throughout the rest of the presentation today. And the two ways is, one is that there's elements of it that are very much geared towards how do I collaborate with a child? And I just want to be transparent. As a teacher, you can utilize this, even without including families, in your conversations with a child. But this can also be part of the approach that you use as you're reaching out to a family as well. As we're closing that gap, once again, suddenly taking a collaborative approach rather than just kind of a my way or the highway approach, so that we're able to provide the highest level of support for that child. And so kind of at the core of this is really looking at the difference between skill and will. One of the biggest kind of, most popular phrases that come out of the collaborative problem solving approach is this idea of kids do well if they can versus kids do well if they want to. And so those sentences or phrases, I should say, seem very similar, but there is kind of this really core and key difference between the two. Kids doing well if they can implies that there is something that they can or cannot do. They either have the skill set to be able to do something, they have the capacity, the support systems in place, the tools in place, they have everything in place to be able to accomplish this thing. So they're able to do it. Where the other is kids do well if they want to. And so with the kids do well if they want to approach, what that is kind of assuming is that if a child is not doing well, they could, but they're just choosing not to in that moment in time. They are just saying, you know what, I want to fail right now. I want to let somebody down right now. I want to disappoint you right now. And the reality is, there's a time and a place for that, and we'll actually take a moment to discuss that here shortly. But for the most part, it probably is much more of a skill development and support place rather than an issue of will. But so often, many of the ways that we respond to behaviors in school imply that it is an issue of will rather than skill. When we do things like, and we'll talk more about this, but rewards and consequences, that is kind of implying that there's that kind of different core issue there. And so the more challenging a behavior becomes, so the more we are getting frustrated by these behaviors, the quicker we are to say, okay, kids do well if they want to. And once again, we may not be verbalizing those words out loud, but a lot of our kind of attitudes begin to kind of fall in line with this idea of like, okay, you don't want to do well. You're choosing to be disruptive. You're choosing to not pay attention. And then when that happens and the student is not doing well, we assume that they don't want to do well. And if we believe that, then our job becomes this whole idea of then we must make our kids want to do well. And the biggest techniques for motivating are typically going to be some version of rewards and punishment. And so once again, when we're reaching out to home, it's usually because, all right, that consequence, that punishment needs to be dished out now. And we are making the family aware of that. And so that's often kind of where that conversation is kind of turning to, and we're reaching out to family. Here's the consequence. Here's kind of this thing that has ultimately gone poorly. Or at times, here's this reward that was not earned. And so we utilize these things to motivate. And now we're frustrated that these things were not nearly as motivating as we wanted them to be. And so there are some things that consequences and rewards can do they can teach very simple lessons of right and wrong. And so, once again, it's not that there's not a time and a place for them whatsoever, but it can help somebody who's in their cortex to learn right and wrong. And especially at younger ages, but all throughout life, sometimes we need these little things when you have cortical control that say, oh, if I don't do this, then I don't have this negative consequence. Or if I do that, I get this positive consequence. And so there is a time and a place where it can teach very, very simplistic lessons. And once again, there's a time and a place for that. And it can provide similarly some level of external motivation. If you have access to your cortex and you care about the future, you can care about rewards or consequences a bit more. And so once again, this is all assuming that you have some basic access to your cortex that allow these tools to work. But as we've talked about in previous sessions, depending on stress, depending on trauma, you may not have consistent access to your cortex. And if you don't have consistent access to your cortex, then rewards and consequences are not going to be nearly as helpful. And there are things that rewards and consequences simply cannot do, whether you're in your cortex or not. They cannot teach you complex thinking skills. They can teach you, once again, kind of right and wrong, but there's no gray area there. It doesn't help to understand the rationale behind the right and the wrong. It's something that's completely tied to the reward or the consequence. And so it's a lot more black and white in that moment. Typically speaking, rewards and consequences are not going to help you to build relationships. Once again, it's not about relationship. It is about what is right and what is wrong. They do not help a student stay regulated. And oftentimes, if you're starting slightly dysregulated and try to dish out rewards and consequences, you're literally speaking in a sense of time in an abstract way that the brain is not ready to fully comprehend. And you end up causing a child to be even less regulated. And then it doesn't help a child to really learn how to solve future problems. And so you're not developing these skills, once again, that are going to help them to really be able to handle something. So if you happen to have a reward or consequence that is so rewarding or so consequential that it's effective to kind of solve one simple problem or one behavioral issue, sometimes that happens because, once again, if we find something that's great enough for them, that can actually kind of do the trick for them. But it doesn't necessarily then develop the skill that they're going to be able to do that in the future unless the reward is equal to or greater than, or the consequence is equal to or greater than the reward that we were just talking about there. Now, as we're thinking about skill versus will, I do think that it's worth adding that there are times that it is more of a will issue, but there's other things that can be interconnected with that. And so there's times that students are intentionally defiant. And generally speaking, though, once again, not exclusively, they're trying to seek one of two things when they're being intentionally defiant. They're trying to seek out connection. And so that could be that they're trying to seek out the connection of their peers. So they want kind of to feel close and connected with others around them. And so once again, when we're under high levels of stress, many of us have heard of the whole fight, flight, or freeze. Another word that's utilized in that is that people will flock, meaning that they will find a group. They want to be seen by others, and that is a safety tool or safety mechanism during times of high stress. And so by doing anything where you're getting the attention of your classmates, getting them to laugh at you or even just see you, there's a safety in that because all of a sudden you don't feel nearly as alone. And even negative attention is better than no attention. So if, someone's not going to hang out with me right now and have a good time and have a good laugh, even just by them kind of redirecting me, yelling at me, getting frustrated at me, at least I know that I'm seen by them. And that feels better than the alternative, which is me feeling like I'm not being seen right now. And then oftentimes as well, if a child feels disrespected by an adult. So if a child is feeling disrespected by you for any reason, they are going to be likely to try to act up and purposefully do that to get under your skin, to do things back at you. Because if they feel disrespected by you, they want to reciprocate that. And so it's important that we're really mindful that there is a time that they might do this on purpose. And we can really be thinking, okay, well, am I kind of making a positive connection with them right now? And if not, they're going to try to do something back at me if they're feeling disrespected. Once again, it's important that we know that that's perception, right? I'm not saying that you are being disrespectful to students, but if they perceive your interactions with them as being disrespectful, then they are going to mirror that in a similar way. Now, the upside to that real quick is that if they perceive you as being respectful and kind and really having a positive connection with them, then they're going to be far more likely to try to mirror that and have a positive relationship back with you. And among other things, that can include a child doing their work and following directions in class. And so those are some of the things that you do to kind of please somebody that you're in relationship with. The other piece of this is that if life is kind of out of control, you seek control, whether that's life outside of school, might be in home, might be in the community, or even if things just seem kind of out of control in the classroom, you try to grab that control back. And so you might intentionally behave in a certain way, but once again, there's a rationale behind it. And so the reason that I say this is that before we kind of move on to the skill building side of things, what I think is important that we realize is that even when it is a child does well if they want to. So even if it is an intentional act of defiance that a child is exhibiting, there's usually more beneath the surface there. There's usually something else that we may want to discover, that we might want to understand why they're doing that. And as we understand that why, suddenly we're going to be in a better spot to be able to support them more. But operating under the assumption that for the most part, kids do well if they can, then what we want to begin to move towards is, how do I help to discover what's getting in the way? How do I help to support them more, realizing that something is getting in the way here? And so that's what we want to do. And once again, sometimes that's going to be between us and the child, but oftentimes this is going to then stretch out as well in the conversations that we have with families. And as we begin to really break down that gap and really operate from a far more collaborative approach. Now, once again, making sure that we're always connecting this to the brain. Chronic stress and trauma can change brain development. So we know that there are times that part of what's happening here is that because of what a child might have experienced or be actively experiencing, they're spending time lower in their brain. And so some of the behaviors of concern are connected to the parts of the brain that they're operating in. And therefore, some of the tools that we've previously spoken about are tools that are going to be advantageous to helping to move that child back up to those higher parts of the brain where they're going to be able to be successful. And so instead of reviewing all of those are kind of absolutely outlined in some previous videos that we've done, but please keep in mind that those are tools that can 100% be utilized to help a child. And those tools can really be part of some of these conversations that we're going to be talking about here in a moment. And so what I think is so important and is kind of an eye-opening thing is when we really think about the development of thinking skills. In schools, we are quick to target interventions and provide different supports for children that are struggling with math and reading, language, other subjects, and things like that. But sometimes we forget that the lagging skills may not specifically be academic skills. They can lack skills with flexibility. They can lack skills with, basic problem solving and their frustration tolerance. All of those are skills that need to be developed. And so if a child is lacking some of those skills, we just kind of believe, okay, well, they just need to fix that on their own. But if it's a math or reading skill, we support them more. You don't take a fourth grader and put them in calculus and be surprised that they don't understand it, and then suddenly say to them, well, if you don't understand this next problem, then you're just going to skip out on recess. Like, that doesn't make any sense. We know that that is a skill that child has not done the work to develop a basic understanding of, and therefore, why the heck would you make a consequence for that? But sometimes we take a child who, for whatever reason, has not developed other skills like frustration tolerance, let's say, and we expect them to just magically be able to handle some of the scenarios that they're in. And then once again, we assume reward and punishment is going to kind of convince them that they need to behave differently. But it's less about convincing them, and it's more about skill development in those moments. And so we need to think, okay, how do we go back and provide for them the supports that they need to be able to develop those things? And one of the biggest first steps to this, which is once again something that we have spoken about in previous sessions, but is this whole idea that we need to shift our mindset and stop taking behaviors personally and instead really kind of go into these things almost as a detective, where we're trying to figure out, okay, what is really going on here? Is it purposeful? And once again, there's some things we need to figure out there. If it's not purposeful, how do we really kind of go about that? What are the things that we need to develop that skill? What are the things that we need to be able to help this child a lot more? And so some of the basic premises behind taking this new approach is that we're going to focus on building skills like flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving, rather than that motivation idea. And the process begins with identifying what are some of these triggers that might be really challenging for a child, and what are some of the things and the skills that they may need to develop. And so really what's kind of core to this, they talk about how when you are kind of addressing an issue or a challenge, there's a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And so I'm going to real quick outline. Plan A is this kind of we submit to the will of the adult. So in this scenario, as a teacher, we are saying, okay, it's my way or the highway as a teacher. This is what I need you to do. These are the consequences if you don't do it. This is what I'll help you to do it, and that's it. And so this is what's going to happen here. And I want to be clear, there's a time and a place for that. There's a time and a place where it's just like, I need you to kind of fall in line here. This is what needs to happen. Often, and especially when it's related to physical and emotional safety of this individual child and other children in the space, yeah, we need to just say, this is the one way that we're doing it, and you need to follow along. But what I find is that we're often pretty quick to default to a plan A. We're often pretty quick to kind of say, okay, this is what needs to happen. And once again, now, as we're thinking about bridging this gap between school and home, we're often not calling home to collaborate. We're calling home to say, here's plan A. This is what needs to happen right now. This is what we need to do. Now, conversely, there's plan C. And plan C is the complete opposite of plan A. And that's where we 100% submit to the will of the child. And so when we're doing plan C, this is where we're going to be far more likely to just kind of ignore behavior, let it go, not worry about it nearly as much. And so we just kind of let that happen a bit more. And there's a time and a place for that, especially if behaviors are not a danger to self or others, especially if behaviors are not causing disruption to other learners. There might be a time and a place that we say, okay, we're just going to let this go right now. It's a short-term fix. It's not a permanent fix, but where we can kind of let that go at the moment. And then we might have to come back to it a little bit more, but not kind of choosing that battle, not getting stuck on that. But then when we think about plan B, oh, I'm sorry. So these are some of those elements that we talked about with that, and picking battles, planned ignoring behaviors and things like that, and knowing that we're going to be ultimately coming back to the things that we're trying to support a child with. But then when we're really thinking about plan B, this is really where collaboration comes into play. And this is where we're making sure that really both parties are having the opportunity to be heard. And we're making sure that we come up with a plan that works for everybody. And so essentially a plan B conversation goes like this. Step one, ingredient one is, coming from the adult perspective, this is the empathy place. This is the understanding the concern of others. And so the first thing that we do is we provide the child the time and the opportunity to share with us what's going on, to do their very best to articulate, here's why I'm, whatever the behavior of concern is, here's what's going on. And sometimes it might be very, very specific to class. Sometimes they might say that there's other things going on in life. Sometimes, it can be a kind of much, much longer conversation. But it's about really hearing what's going on with them, and then really getting specific with, well, what are your needs? Are your needs, movement? Are your needs to, be in connection with others? Are your needs to whatever it might be? Like, what are the specific needs that aren't being met when they're already in class, and really giving them time to share that. And the hardest part about this is it's about us being willing and able to sit back and give them the time and the space to talk without interrupting, without leading them to specific answers. We can ask questions, but try not to lead them to what you think is really going on. Allow them to share some of those ideas. Once you've given them the opportunity to really share a lot of what's going on with them, then it's your opportunity to share, and you get to share your concerns. And oftentimes our concerns are about that child learning and that child growing and that child being safe and the other children around being safe and learning and growing. But whatever the case might be, really trying to have that kind of conversation and opportunity to do that. And then step 3 is collaboration. And that's where you then get to say, okay, how are we going to move forward from here? What does this plan look like as we are trying to successfully move beyond whatever these kind of current behaviors of concern might be? And then you and the child both get to add in what are some things that we think might work. And basically, it's all going through the filter of your concerns and the child's concerns now. And so when you share an idea, we say, okay, does that match your concerns and my concerns? Yes, no. They share an idea. Does that match your concerns and my concerns? Does that meet all of our needs? You know, they might have a great solution to help keep them calm, but it might be a really noisy solution. You're like, that doesn't match my concern of keeping kind of a quiet learning environment. So, all right, that's not a possible one, but let's come up with one together. And then when we actually come up with solutions that we believe really meet both of our concerns well, that's where we really get to this place that is hopefully going to have a higher likelihood of having a successful result. And then the reality is, it's not that it's a once and done thing, but we keep having these conversations again and again. But they get faster and faster as you go. Because what I found often happens when we first try to do these is that a child might not be very used to communicating what they're going through. They might not be very used to really having a voice in all this. And so the first couple of times you do it, you just get a lot of like, I don't know. I don't know why I did that. I don't know what I need. I don't need anything. I'm fine. But the more comfortable they get with this reality that they have a voice, the more they get to this place where they're able to communicate that and articulate some of the things that they might need to be successful. And so we know that, you know, we have this belief that kids want to do well. That's kind of at the core of this. We also know that we as adults want it as well. Teachers, staff, we want to be able to do well. And so we want to be able to lead well. And this is kind of, once again, what's kind of so core to this is making sure that we're coming from this place of collaboration, where we know that we are really trying to meet the needs of ourselves, of the child. And then ultimately, once again, that collaboration with the family as well, as we're trying to support them. And so lots of times when we talk about this, people have this concern, how long does, you know, one of these conversations actually take? And the reality is that for one, you got to think what you're balancing it against, which is often these behavioral disruptions. So once again, these issues that then cause us to have to reach out to home, these behaviors that cause us to really have these kind of bigger conversations, and that often have a lot of negative emotions tied to them. That is often, you know, they've done some research on this, takes up about 2.5 hours in a week, which if that's happening on a weekly basis can actually equal 3 full weeks by the end of a school year. Where by contrast, when we're able to have these shorter conversations, these CPS conversations, on average, they take about 7.5 minutes. Once again, that's keeping in mind that some might be a bit longer, and for some bigger problems are a bit longer, and some are going to end up being a lot shorter. But when we're coming into it from this place of collaboration, we're also avoiding a lot of the negative emotion that can be involved in what we're trying to do. And then really what we're ultimately building up to is kind of creating this kind of culture of collaborative problem solving. And so this is a really recommended way to support children, where really we can default to again and again, did we ask the child what they need? And so as a, you know, adult, you can be asking yourself that. As you're talking to families, we can really be, you know, bringing up that, like, well, did we ask the child what they need? Sometimes a family reaches out to us and like, oh, they're not doing their work or whatever. Well, did you ask them what they need? So really getting used to communicating that. This works between adults too. So sometimes the issue is between the adults and isn't as involved with the children. Well, we can take a more collaborative approach where we don't even have to include the child. It's more about what do we need adult to adult to make this be more successful. And the more we do it, the more comfortable it becomes, the more streamlined it becomes, as we've talked about. And even if you're beginning, I mean, it's a great way to begin a relationship, always kind of taking this collaborative approach. But even if you kind of have a negative relationship already with families, this is a great way to begin to repair. It's a great place to kind of start now and begin to transform that relationship into something that's going to be far more positive as we begin to move into the future. And so I really appreciate your time as always. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. But I really, once again, believe that this can be a great approach to begin to foster great relationships with the families of the students that you serve and can really begin to close that gap so that you can both collaboratively be supporting your students in a really amazing way. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time.